go ahead and talk about some of the books that I have been loving this past month in my Fed wrap-ups. Okay, so I have 3 books physically here. The other one I have already returned to the library. Also, can we please start to normalize using the library? Not everyone wants to go out and buy a book. Not everyone has the means to go out and buy a book, and also we should support our local libraries, and all these novels will be going back to the library as soon as we talk about them. So if you didn't know, I recently embarked on reading all of the New York Times top 100 lists of this 21st century. They released this whole list on some of the best novels of the 21st century, and I would like to consider myself an avid reader, and so I thought, why not read them all? The first one I'm going to talk about today is The Argonauts by Maggie Nelson. If you want any shorter versions, then I have some shorts that also talk about each of these books individually, but this is where I'm going to dive into detail just a tad bit more. This novel is a memoir, and this is Maggie depicting her experiences of motherhood, challenges with identity, what it means to, how it means to identify, sex, love, and really just the nature of human beings in general. And I found the questions that she was asking to be not revolutionary per se, but not commonplace either. So I would hope that folks are having these conversations with their loved ones and those that are important to them, but I don't believe it's commonplace in society. So some of those questions would be, do mothers inherently love their children? What does it really mean to care for a child? Why is there this emphasis on women playing this submissive role? What does sex look like? Does it look different in different relationships? Is that okay? All these questions that I found to be really great. I feel like I'm always that person who oftentimes is asking the question that makes someone a little uncomfortable, and so I found her to be asking all these questions that I was just snapping my fingers to and agreeing wholeheartedly. And I think also the way that she talks about motherhood, and especially the idea of giving birth and birthing a child versus adopting or caring for a child in a different way, I found that she really just destroyed the idea of biological birth being the only way to have a loving relationship. And I would hope that's, old news at this point, but I do know that there are still some circles of people who believe that, or who have a preference toward a biological child just because they believe that there is some tie that mothers might have with their children. But we also see that there are plenty of people who identify as female who then give birth and don't have this metaphysical connection to their child either. So I loved it. I think the way that she talked about labor and how she gave birth to her son and all the challenges with that, and she really made it quite, well, she depicted it in a gory way, and I actually appreciated that, because I think oftentimes when folks are talking about giving birth, they just talk about how wonderful it is to have a baby, and they don't talk about all the changes that go through a woman's body and how much of a toll that can take on them and how much of a challenge it actually is. And so I really appreciated that she didn't just skip right to the gumdrops and rainbows, but she depicted the whole experience really fully. I think also the way that she reflected on motherhood and what it means to be a mother as she was examining her own relationship with her own mother was really honest and really raw. I didn't explicitly say this, but she depicted an instance where her mother just was never happy in her relationship with her father. She had this anger towards her father for treating her mother this way, and also an anger towards her mother for allowing herself to stay in that situation. And I think a lot of people will be able to resonate with that, because oftentimes it's easy from the outside to have an opinion or to comment, but I think sometimes we don't extend the same level of empathy that we do to other situations with those that are in that kind of a relationship. So I found it to be really wonderful. I think that if you're interested in topics such as motherhood, identity, sex, you are going to love this. I would say the one caveat that I have is that she studied, I think, philosophy or psychology in her undergrad, and so she brings in a lot of theorists and philosophers in her, usually just in an argument of taking their theory and then really debunking it. But If you are not exposed to those theorists, or if you haven't taken like a Psych 101 class in undergrad, I would say, then it might not be the most accessible for you. You might want to do a little Google just so you can understand the theory a little bit more and understand exactly what she's talking about. Oftentimes if she was talking about an author or something, I had no idea who she was talking about and I had to do a little Google. And I took a Psych 101 class. I have a master's degree, so I would think that I'm in the general population of just, you know, an audience member, and I found this to not be the most accessible in that one regard. But otherwise, I really enjoyed it, and it really resonated with a lot of what she was saying, and it made me feel a little bit more seen. So the Argonauts is the yes for me. Moving right along to Mercy by Toni Morrison. First off, we love Toni Morrison, and can we appreciate this cover? I mean, this back cover, because she's looking graceful and very beautiful. Side note, I've just been really appreciating women in their 50s and 60s and older. Just been appreciating their line, their beauty, and the grace and wisdom that comes with that age. So I'm looking forward to getting there one day. Anyway, the novel. It's a historical fiction read, and it follows really the beginnings of the West African slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade. We follow Florence as she is bought by a Dutch farmer, is transported, makes a home on this new farm, and her experiences with her first love, with abandonment, with trying to reconcile what it means to live in her skin, and colorism. A lot of themes that you often visit if you're thinking of major movies like 12 Years a Slave, or I'm Going by Yagassi. That's another novel that's a historical fiction read. So I think it allowed you to really take a look at religion and actually the use of religion to indoctrinate and to suppress groups, and the way that was used during the transatlantic slave trade. I found Florence's journey to hurt the heart a little bit. I did find her perseverance and her ability to still get up every day to be quite heartening, and the writing style as well was really beautiful. There was so much imagery, and there was one major image that was just tied throughout the novel. So in the beginning, Florence is described by her mother as having baby soft feet. She is described as this princess who has to be protected, essentially. And unbeknownst to Florence, she is really sold away from her mother, given away because her mother was trying to protect her from her former owner, because Florence was just becoming a woman and she felt as if she would be prey in that regard. And so Florence is seen as having this baby soft feet. She's really protected and young and vulnerable. By the end of the novel, Florence writes a note to her mother essentially saying, "My feet are hardened now. There's calluses, you know, there's no more protecting me. Whatever that could have been protected has already been taken away or tarnished." And I felt like that was a little vicious by Miss Morrison to have that be the last thing that we read, but it tied the story together really beautiful. And another one that I would say is strong and ripe for conversation. So always a goodie and definitely worthy of being on the NYT Top 100 list. A little bit more joyful, but also not really. The only reason that it's joyful really is because it is told from the perspective of a child. So this is Persepolis by Marjane Satrapi, and this is really talking about Marjane's experience witnessing the Islamic Revolution in Iran and also the early war with Iraq, and just her experience growing up as a young child. I think the story goes from the ages of 6 to 13 or around that age, so really just her development, her adolescence, witnessing this huge cultural shift, this huge cultural change in her country. And I think, again, those bigger themes, identity, religion, children, and really just how susceptible they are to outside influences. And so you'll see that Marjane's opinion of what's going on around her to really change. So first she's kind of pro-revolution, and then she's not really understanding why it's happening per se. In school, the material that they're given is pro-government, and so she takes a little bit of that in, but then she goes home and her parents are revolutionaries, and so they're very anti, and she doesn't really know what to believe, what to do, and so she is attempting to discover herself and what her beliefs are through the lens of a huge cultural shift. And I found how she was relating to herself and others to be really quite wise. And also I think that children have this ability to, again, you know, they sometimes don't have filters and they just say what's on their mind. It'll come through the lens of curiosity, but it'll be, you know, a huge statement, or it'll be like a huge turning point. For example, Marjane's grandfather was a prisoner of war and he was waterboarded, so he was tortured, and one of the images that her grandmother uses to describe his hands and his skin after that torture was the pruning that happens on your fingers after you're in the bath for a really long time, for example. And Marjane walks out of the shower one day and looks at her hands and it's like, oh, you know, this must have been similar to grandpa. And having a child say that to a parent or to themselves even, like, oh, this, you know, I'm looking at my hands and I'm seeing an experience from just taking a shower, and that immediately makes me think of my grandfather who was tortured. Marjane's innocence, she has to grow up really quickly. I don't think that is held on very long. The resilience of children is depicted throughout the novel, and the resilience of Marjane especially is seen here just through the ways that she continues to dress as she would like, continues to go out and protest, continues to wear her hair without a covering and ask big questions and continue to rebel in the classroom. And so I found her to be really funny, and it was really humorous and really digestible. This huge, I want to say world-altering event that occurred in the Middle East, was seeing it through the lens of a child was really refreshing. So I would 1000% recommend. I don't know how I've gone so long without reading it, but it was a treat. Okay, so the last novel I actually don't have with me because it was due at the lib, so I returned it, as you should return all your books on time. Anyway, it was Trust by Hernan Diaz. I'll pop a little photo of it. And this novel is based in New York, and it's exploring this one couple, Andrew and Mildred Bevell, and it's told from actually within that one novel there are 3 different depictions, or 3 different authors. One is from someone who is more of an acquaintance to the couple. The other is from the point of view of someone who wrote an autobiography for Andrew Bevell, and the last is actually clippings of a journal from Mildred Bevell. So we finally get to the true reality of what life was in that last third of the book. So I found it to be really interesting how Hernan wove the story. So we get all of these misconstrued ideas of the couple in the first third. The second third maybe a little bit closer to the truth, because again, it's written from Andrew's perspective, but it's transcribed and so just filled in with parts of their lives that wasn't true. We later realized that from the autobiographer, because Andrew asked her to do so to make it more appealing to the audiences. Anyway, that's the second third. The last third is where everything that we maybe have been thinking or that we didn't realize was challenged, and I found it to be fun, actually a little thrilling. I wasn't expecting that. And I thought some of the bigger themes were money, prestige, notoriety, what it means to have power. Essentially, that's what most people are aspiring towards when you're making a lot of money or when you surpass a certain level of wealth. I think oftentimes the next scale is power, because what's the difference between 1 billion and 2 billion? You know, the world is still your oyster either way, but it's that power piece that oftentimes those folks are aspiring to. And so I found that to be really, I wouldn't say the most interesting to me, because I've never been the person who wants to make a ton of money, or have really been interested in finances to that extent, honestly. I'm maybe a little bit more of a communist, but not actually. So there are other parts of the novel that really tied me in. So I think it was written really beautifully, and I think having those three different perspectives also was interesting, because you would think that you understood one aspect of the relationship and the marriage, but then in the second third you have to relearn everything. And then in the final third, from Mildred's perspective, there are some Easter eggs I'm not going to ruin, but I found that part to be the most enjoyable. And the only little hint that I'm going to give is that it's always the women. And that quote, behind every strong man there is a strong woman, or behind every powerful man there's a strong woman, or whatever that quote is. I think oftentimes the way that women were really innovative in the early 1900s by standing behind their husbands, or being that whisper in the ear, or being the Lady Macbeth, I found to be titillating. I loved it. I love women who are strong and who challenge the norm, and I found Mildred to 1000% reach that pedestal. So that was Trust by Renan Diaz. If you enjoyed, go ahead and watch the short version. If you want maybe a little bit more of an in-depth look at the book, I have a dedicated short to that on my shorts page. But until next month, that is February wrapped.